Hello, my name is James Ritson and I'm the product expert for Affinity Photo. I'm going to show you some various techniques and approaches for infrared photography post-production using Affinity Photo. We will be focusing on techniques like channel swapping, blend modes, adjustment and filter layers, and brushwork. Now for my first example, I will start with a RAW file taken from a full spectrum camera with a 590 nanometer filter. This gives us a good blend of red spectrum wavelengths and infrared wavelengths. Now this is opened in the Develop persona. For those unfamiliar with the Affinity apps, we have these personas at the top left, and they are basically different workspaces for different tasks. Now, as I'm developing a RAW file, the Develop persona mostly consists of panels that contain various adjustments I can perform to my initial image. As with most of my other workflows, I don't really do very much in terms of initial RAW development. For this image, I might just bring the highlights in, so I'm not clipping the red channel information up here on the histogram, and I'll also move the black point to compress the tones slightly and bring the blue channel information away from absolute black. It's worth noting that you can apply further edits at this stage. I could, for example, increase clarity to really enhance the structure or texture within the image. But we can do this all non-destructively during the main editing process. So I will reset that for now and click Develop. Great. Now that we have our developed image, you'll see we are in the main photo persona. This offers us all the main tools, adjustments, filters, and other functionality we require for day-to-day editing. The first thing I will want to do for this false color image is swap the red and blue channel information. We can achieve this non-destructively with a channel mixer adjustment. So on the dialog here, we are currently targeting red. So what we want to do is set the red contribution to 0, tab across to blue, set that to 100, then switch across to blue and do the reverse. So set red contribution to 100, tab across to blue, set that to 0. Now at this stage, we've effectively swapped a red color cast for a blue one. We want to neutralize these tones a little bit so we can have an easier job pulling out some more subtle color detail. Now, one great way of doing this is with the Divide Blend mode, and I'm going to use this in conjunction with a new fill layer. So this creates a non-destructive vector fill layer which we can recolor on the fly. We could even draw out a gradient if we wanted to, but I'll forego that for now. So first, we need to hide the fill layer. Then, across on the color panel up here, I want to click drag my color picker onto my document, and I'm going to try and color pick off a nice, cool blue tone from the building. Something about here. So I'll release the mouse button. Then I've got my color in my color picker well here. I just need to click that to assign it to the fill layer. Then I can show the fill layer and set the layer's blend mode to divide. So instantly, this gives us a brilliant color cast correction, and it also separates the red and blue tones more, which is very handy for further color work. Now then, let's give this image a bit more punch with a curves adjustment. I'll use a shortcut for that. So on Mac, that's Command M, and on Windows, Control M, and on the curves dialog here, I think I'll just create a node roughly here, then single click and drag, create another node here, start to push these tones up, perhaps control the highlights a bit, bring them back down here. And that just gives us some more dramatic contrast in our image so far. Now comes my favorite part, which is color manipulation. Now I cannot get enough of the selective color adjustment. It's just so powerful both for separating colors and also drastically altering them. For example, on reds here, let's just zoom in so we can see the effect. I'll drag cyan down and then push magenta to 100 and yellow to 100. And across on yellows, we'll do a similar thing. It's very subtle, but it does affect the vibrance of the foliage. Let's bring cyan down and yellow up. So already, if I hide this adjustment, you can see we're starting to achieve a nice effect on the foliage here. Then let's just come back out to look at the sky. So to tackle the sky, I'll switch across to cyans. I actually want to just reduce cyans slightly, then boost magenta, and perhaps take yellow down slightly as well. Okay, and there we go. So just with this one adjustment, we've got this lovely rich tone to the red and yellow detail, and we've also recolored the sky a much more palatable shade of blue. So here's the before and then the after. Now we could take this a step further using an HSL adjustment. Again, I'll use a shortcut for this, so that's Command U on Mac, Control U on Windows. And again, let's just zoom in to see the areas we want to affect in more detail. So I will switch across to reds on the dialog here, and let's bring the luminosity up. And you'll see as I do this, it affects the brightness of the red foliage detail here. Okay, but increasing luminosity also reduces color intensity, so we can compensate for this by bringing the saturation slider up as well. Let's move across to cyans, have a look at the sky here, and let's do a similar thing. So let's bring luminosity up, and perhaps just bring saturation up slightly as well. Okay, and you know what? Looking at this, I might just move across to reds and bring that saturation up more as well. There we go. So at this stage, let's look at filter work. We may want to add some fine detail sharpening to this image, as it's quite soft. Love it or hate it, one of the things about Affinity Photo's raw development is that it doesn't add any default sharpening. This is left up to the user. You could of course add it during the raw development process, while you are in the developed persona, but then you wouldn't be able to mask it to just the foreground detail and exclude the sky, which as we can see already has some noise in it. So that's what I'm going to do now. I will select the background pixel layer, that's the image, and therefore I want to base my selection off that pixel data. I will select the selection brush tool over here. Then I'll just click, drag, and brush into the foreground to make a rough selection of the building. I can actually move into quick mask mode using Q, and this just lets me double check what my selection is looking like so far. This is quite useful, especially if you're working with high contrast detail, and it's sometimes hard to actually see the marching ants. Now let's jump into selection refinement by going to Refine on the context toolbar up here, and the dialog is obscuring some of the detail we need to get to, so I'll just move this out of the way slightly. And what this allows us to do is first I'll just increase my brush width and then drag over these difficult areas. So all of the chimneys on the building here, and then the tree detail to the left and right of the image. And I can release my mouse button to matte this selection. Now we're not doing cutout work here, we're just using this to create a mask for our sharpening, so it doesn't have to be amazingly precise. That said, I will switch to the background brush and just mark these areas here. We can see some cloud detail very close to the building has been brought through, so we can just get rid of that. And also on the building itself, we have what we call matte bleed, so I can switch to the foreground brush and just brush in over those areas to include them in the actual selection. Okay, that looks good enough for a sharpening mask, so I will click Apply, and I now have my refined selection. So I can add a live unsharp mask filter layer. By default, this child layers into the layer I just had selected. That's the background pixel image information, so that's absolutely fine. I can deselect using Command D on Mac or Control D on Windows. Then I'll just set my radius to 2 pixels, let's try that for now, and set a factor of 2. Okay, looking nice. So you'll notice on the layer thumbnail here, this unsharp mask is masked to just the foreground detail. So the sky is not being sharpened at all. I can actually just hide this layer and you can see the before and the after. So the building detail is being adequately sharpened whilst leaving that noisy sky alone. Now, I mentioned that live filters will child layer by default. Depending on your workflow, you may not want this behavior. You can change it very quickly by going to the assistant options up here and changing this option, adding filter layer to selection, to add filter as new layer. So as a final touch, I'll add some nice diffuse glow to the whole image. So let me move back up to the top of the layer stack and I will add a live Gaussian blur filter. So because we just changed that behavior, it no longer child layers into the HSL shift adjustment, but rather becomes its own parent layer in the layer stack. Okay, so on this live Gaussian blur dialog, let's check preserve alpha, drag the radius up, and set the blend mode to overlay. Okay, this is far too strong, and we're also getting a bordering effect because of the fill layer, which has a divide blend mode. And we can tackle both of these issues using blend ranges. So with the layer selected, let's click the cog icon over here to access the blend ranges dialog. And this effectively allows us to blend this layer based on tonal range. So here, if I drag the left-hand node all the way down and uncheck linear, I can draw out an S-curve. So here, I'm blending the Gaussian blur effect out of the darker tones in the image, but gradually letting them blend into the brighter tones. I might revise this further and just modify the curve slightly. But really, you can have a lot of powerful control over how your layers blend together parametrically using this option. The great thing about using live filters to achieve these kind of effects as well is that they are completely non-destructive. So I could hide my Gaussian blur, and you can see the before and the after, but I'm also free to experiment with masking, blend modes, and also opacity. So for example, I might just take this down to 70% opacity using 7 on the keyboard and see how that looks, or I might even try 50%. Finally then, let's give this image a crop to promote focus on the foreground detail. So I will quickly select the crop tool using C and then just drag the top crop handle down to about here, and then perhaps just get the bottom crop handle, bring that in slightly, and then use return on the keyboard to commit that crop. Don't worry though, cropping is completely non-destructive, so if you feel that perhaps I've cropped too much, I can just select the crop tool using C. We have this option here, reveal, on the context toolbar, that will show you everything outside of the current crop bounds, and you're free just to move the handles, then recommit that crop. So my image is now ready to export, which I could do through File and Export, and I've got my various formats here that I can export to. Let's take a look now at creating a monochrome infrared image. We will start with this image taken from an unmodified camera with a 720 nanometer filter in front of the lens. Now for this example, I have purposefully left the white balance on auto to show you how to tackle an extreme white balance color cast. To be frank, I wouldn't advocate leaving a camera on auto white balance if you're going to be shooting infrared. It tends to skew the balance to such an extent that you end up exposing for one channel, red in this case, at the expense of the others. You can see on the histogram here that the blue and green channels are severely underexposed, so when we finally balance out the tones, we can expect to see some noise in the final image. Nevertheless, we can easily correct such a heavy imbalance we simply select the white balance tool from the tools panel on the left here, and then I'm just going to zoom in and single click over an area of the foliage, like so. Okay, we also need to correct the underexposure, so let's bring brightness all the way up and also bring the exposure slider up. That will do it for my raw development, so let's click develop and move to the photo persona. Now before I do anything else, I just want to level the picture off slightly. We can see the building looks askew here, so C for the crop tool, and then to use the straighten tool I just prefer to use keyboard shortcuts again. So that's Command on Mac, Control on Windows. Just hold that down, then draw out the guideline, release the mouse button, and then I just need to crop away the extreme edges here, like so. Okay. I've actually just missed this area over here, so not a problem. Just use the crop tool again, bring that in, commit the crop. Now, even though we are going for a monochrome or a black and white conversion, I will do a channel swap like we did previously with the false color image. So channel mixer, switch across to red, swap those round, do the same to blue, like so. We've got quite a nice vintage color effect here. It's almost tempting not to go for a monochrome conversion, but let's do that all the same. So I will add a black and white adjustment layer, and the red detail is looking a little bit washed out here. So let's bring the red slider down slightly to about here, and let's push cyan up slightly. That doesn't really have much of an effect. It's just boosting some very faint sky detail here. Now it's time to get stuck in with some manual brushwork. I use this technique frequently for most of my photography work to rebalance lighting and direct the viewer's eye to areas of the composition I want them to focus on. So we can create a new pixel layer down here, select the paintbrush tool, just make sure our brush hardness up here is set to 0% for a nice soft edge brush. We've got our black and white colors here, that's fine. Switch over to white to begin with, and we want to set the blend mode of this layer to overlay. Let's try an opacity of around 25%. So now I can just paint in with white over the areas that I want to emphasize. Then I can toggle across to black either by clicking over here or using X on the keyboard. So now I'm set to black. I can paint into the foreground detail here, as I just kind of want to de-emphasize this slightly. Okay. And then you can always layer this effect up with more pixel layers. So for example, I might create a second layer, once again set the blend mode to overlay, opacity down to 25%, switch across to white, and I might just increase my brush width and just single click and stamp into the middle here. So this area featuring the statue and the path up to the building. So let me just select both of these layers and hide them, so you can see the before and the after. So the idea is to try and keep the brushwork subtle. For example, if you hadn't have seen this process in action, you may not know, looking at the final image, that brushwork has been used to change the balance of the lighting. Now, just to stay organized with these two layers selected, I'm going to group them. So Command G on Mac, Control G on Windows, and let's just rename this brushwork. Now, another technique that's useful for any black and white conversion is to put color manipulation adjustments underneath the black and white adjustment layer. For example, I might add a selective color adjustment. Just make sure that's sitting underneath the black and white adjustment. Then across on reds, I might just bring all three sliders up, and it just makes the building and certain foreground areas slightly darker, and it adds a bit more contrast into the scene. We can actually do this now because of our brushwork. So if I hid this group, you would see that the building is perhaps too dark, and our focus is drawn more to the foreground. But with the layers on, it balances out quite nicely. Okay, the final technique I would like to show you is one I use with pretty much every image. Sometimes when we are editing a document or an image that fills our screen, we lose sight of how that image might be perceived at smaller sizes, especially in terms of brightness and coherence between different areas. Now, I like to add a final adjustment such as curves or brightness and contrast. So at the top of the layer stack here, I'll just add a curves adjustment. Then I like to zoom out so that my image is occupying a much smaller area, similar to if I was viewing the image on a smaller device, like a phone or a tablet. I will then tweak the tones accordingly until the image has a tonal look that satisfies what I'm after. So I have to look at this and think, even at this small representation, do the tones leap out? Can you tell what's in the image? What are the key focal points? These sorts of questions. And I'll tend to craft my final tonal decisions around how the image looks when it's smaller. And I usually find this works quite well for social media and website delivery in particular. Let me just see the before and after once again. Okay. Then we'll come back to our usual zoom level. Now, sometimes you might feel that what works for a smaller version doesn't work for a larger size. Luckily, Photo has a feature called Snapshots. This isn't exposed by default. We can show the Snapshots panel by going to View and Studio, and then enabling Snapshots. So in addition to my background snapshot, which is created when we first develop or open an image, I can create an additional snapshot here, and let's call this smaller. Okay, but then I might double-click my curves adjustment, reset this, and try something that perhaps works better for a larger representation of the image. This will do nicely. So now I'll save this as larger. And I can very easily just toggle between these snapshots using the Restore Snapshot option. I could even go back to my initial edit if I wanted to, before I did any further layer work. Anyway, that concludes my session. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this has given you some ideas for infrared post-production. Most of these techniques will apply to other workflows as well, so do have fun and experiment. Take care, and all the best.